12 minutes before Claire
Please,
Bennett was supposed to
help me
marry a
stop
man
this.
she'd stopped loving months earlier, she grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark and pulled me into the flower room at
All
Larkspur
of
Hall,
it.
like I was
The
the only
wedding,
person there
the
she
deal,
trusted.
whatever you want to
I had
call
a
it.
camera around my neck and a memory card half full of pictures of her getting her hair pinned into place. And I still didn't understand what was happening when she shut the door behind us and pressed her back against it, like she thought someone might try to push it open. Please, help me stop this. I want to say I asked something smart first. I didn't. I just stood there holding a camera that had cost me 11 months' worth of savings, looking at a bride in a fitted ivory dress with her hair still half pinned, and I said the only thing that came to me. Stop what, exactly? She let out a breath that shook on the way out. All of it. The wedding. The deal. Whatever you want to call it. Past the door, a string quartet was tuning up somewhere in the garden, 4 thin notes drifting in and out of key before they finally found each other. A woman's voice called Claire's name in the hallway, bright and sing-song, the way people call out to brides on their wedding day. Claire flinched like she'd been touched with something hot. My name is Julian Cross. I'm 32. I run a small photography studio out of a converted shrimp warehouse near the Charleston harbor, and up until that afternoon, the biggest decision I usually made on a wedding day was whether to shoot the vows from the left aisle or the right. I did not plan on becoming the person a bride confessed her second thoughts to, 12 minutes before walking down an aisle in front of 200 guests. But there I was, and there she was, and the quartet outside had just started playing something that sounded suspiciously close to a processional. That's the seating music, not the processional, Claire said, reading my face. We've still got a little time, not much. Her hands were shaking. I noticed because I notice hands for a living. It's half of what separates a photograph that feels true from one that just feels posed. And hers were doing something I recognized, though I couldn't yet place from where. Her fingers kept finding the beading at her waist, like she needed to feel something solid. Okay, I said. Talk fast. She talked fast. She'd stopped loving Preston back in the spring, if she was honest. Somewhere between his 3rd canceled dinner and the 4th time his father corrected her in public like she worked for him. But calling it off had never felt like only her decision. The rescue investment Richard needed would close only after the marriage became legal, and Claire had spent 4 months telling herself that trading her own happiness for 400 jobs was a fair trade. Then last night, at the rehearsal dinner, she'd stepped onto the side terrace of Nathaniel Ward's house to escape a toast running long, and heard her almost father-in-law on the phone in his study, window cracked, using the voice men use when they think no one worth impressing is listening. He'd said something about the mill. He'd said something about a joint voting trust, Richard's voting rights transferring into it the moment the marriage was legal. Nathaniel named sole trustee. He'd said, clear as anything, the vote on the board would be his alone. Richard is my father, Claire said, like I might need reminding, though I didn't. I'd photographed her parents' anniversary party 8 months earlier, back when Claire was 27 and already wearing a ring that had clearly cost more than my car. And the mill is his company, his grandfather's company. 400 people work there. Her jaw tightened. Preston's father is going to take it apart and sell the land to some hotel group. I heard him say it, word for word. And the moment that trust takes effect, there's nothing stopping him. I asked if she'd told her father. Of course she had. She'd found him at 11 that night, 3 drinks into believing his troubles were finally behind him. And when she tried to explain what she'd heard, he'd put both hands on her shoulders and said wedding nerves made people hear things that weren't there. Then Nathaniel had appeared in the hallway before she could try again, smiling at her the way people smile when they want you to know it could stop any time they chose, and said he'd hate for her to embarrass her father by repeating rumors on a night that was supposed to be about family. She'd even asked Preston once, 3 weeks earlier, what exactly his father's investment required of them. He'd laughed it off, said finance talk was above both their pay grades, and steered them back to caterers. She hadn't slept. She'd spent the morning getting her hair pinned by a stranger, listening to her mother cry happy tears in the next room, and she had nothing but fragments of a conversation through a cracked window and a rich man's threat dressed up as concern. Someone knocked on the flower room door. Not hard. 2 knuckles, testing. Claire. 10 minutes, honey. Your mother's asking. Marissa Todd had a voice built for calming down brides, and it slid straight through the wood like the door wasn't even there. 1 second, Claire called back. Too fast, too bright. We looked at each other. I could hear my own pulse doing something ugly in my ears. Whatever I decided in the next 30 seconds was going to be the decision, not a version I could quietly take back at the reception, not something I could undo on Monday. I'd either remain only the photographer, or I'd cross a line that would change what happened next, and there wasn't a version of that afternoon where I got to do both quietly. I thought about the 4 years I'd spent building cross photography out of a second-hand lens and a folding table at farmers markets into a business that could book out a full wedding season. I thought about the vendor agreement I'd signed with Marissa's company, the one with a clause about not interfering with the timeline of an event, the kind of clause that could get me blacklisted from half the venues between here and Savannah if I did something stupid enough with it. Then I thought about a morning 3 years back when I'd stood in a hotel room in a rented tie, 20 minutes from marrying a woman named Isabel, and realized somewhere between the mirror and the door that I was about to promise forever to someone out of momentum instead of love. I'd called it off. It had been the ugliest, most necessary thing I'd ever done, and it took the better part of a year to stop calling it cowardice. Nobody had grabbed my wrist that morning. Nobody had asked if I needed help stopping it. I'd had to find that courage alone, in a mirror, with 20 minutes on the clock. Claire had barely more than half that, and she wasn't alone, not anymore. I decided I wasn't going to make her find it by herself. I opened the door before I could talk myself out of it. Marissa was still right there in the hallway, headset and clipboard, radiating the specific stress of a woman with 400 moving parts to keep on schedule. "There you are," she said, already turning to knock on the next door down the hall. "We really do need to." "I need 15 minutes, I said. "Maybe 20. She blinked at me like I'd started speaking a language she used to know. "Julian, the ceremony starts at 4. "The light in the garden's wrong." I heard myself say it and marveled a little at how steady my voice sounded when everything underneath it was anything but. Direct sun, harsh shadows straight across the arch. It'll wash out every photo you paid for. Give me until it clears those oak trees, and I'll get you something you can put on a wall instead of something you'll want to forget. It wasn't entirely a lie. The light really was hard and flat at 4 o'clock in June, and I had complained about that exact stand of oaks during the venue walkthrough 2 months earlier. Marissa hesitated, torn between her schedule and 4 years of trusting my judgment. 20 minutes, she said finally. Not one more. Claire's mother is already 3 drinks into thinking about her only daughter getting married. Claire disappeared back into hair and makeup with her maid of honor, throwing me a look that was equal parts terror and hope. I went the other way, down the east hall of Larkspur Hall, past a wall of black and white cotton broker photographs, toward the library where Nathaniel Ward had set up what he'd been calling his war room for the weekend. The door stood open 2 inches. I could hear him already out in the garden, laughing at something with a senator's aide, the sound carrying in through a window somewhere. I told myself I was allowed to be in this hallway. I was the photographer. I could be anywhere in the building with a camera around my neck, and no one would ask a single question. I pushed the door open the rest of the way with 2 fingers. The desk was a mess of contracts and a laptop still logged in, and a leather folio embossed with Ward Capital's initials, the publicly traded investment firm carrying his name, left open like Nathaniel had never imagined anyone in this house would think to look. I photographed fast, the way you shoot a ring detail when the officiant's already clearing his throat. No thinking, just muscle memory, angle and click, a signed voting trust agreement, Richard's name already on it. A document that, I'd learn later, he'd been told would split control evenly between both families, right up until the buried clause on its last page named Nathaniel sole trustee the moment his son married Claire. A page on Bennett Textiles letterhead with a paragraph highlighted in yellow that used the phrase change of control 3 times in 4 sentences. An unsigned draft sale agreement, prepared for execution the following Monday, for the sale of 11 riverfront acres, the Mills acreage, I was almost certain, to a hospitality group I recognized from a billboard off the interstate. 2 pages back, an internal ownership schedule listed a shell entity as a minority owner of that same hospitality group. The entity's name meant nothing to me then. I didn't understand every clause. I understood enough to know that whatever Richard Bennett believed he'd agreed to, it wasn't this. Footsteps in the hall. Fast ones. A man's stride, not stopping to admire the cotton broker photographs. I had maybe 4 seconds. I clicked the laptop screen dark on instinct, dropped my phone into my back pocket, and raised the camera toward the bookshelves, focusing on nothing, just a row of leather spines, click, click. When Preston Ward filled the doorway in his tuxedo, tie loose around an unbuttoned collar, he looked at me. He looked at the desk. For one very long half-second, I thought I was about to lose everything I'd built out of a folding table and a second-hand lens. "Sorry," I said, before he could ask. "Your father's assistant told me this room had the best light in the house for a groom portrait." I was trying to find an angle that didn't have a shelf of legal thrillers in the background. I held up the camera like proof of something. "Bad idea. I'll find somewhere else." Preston's eyes stayed on me a beat too long. He wasn't stupid. I'd shot enough weddings to know the difference between a groom who's simply nervous and one searching a stranger's face for a lie. But a groom minutes from his own ceremony usually has exactly one thing on his mind, and it isn't a photographer's excuse. "Fine," he said at last, already checking his cufflink instead of me. "Just not in here. My father hates people touching his desk." "Noted," I said, and got out before my hands could shake the way I felt them wanting to. Halfway down the hall, I pulled up the camera's wireless transfer app and pushed the shots straight to my phone, a habit built for showing nervous couples a quick preview mid-shoot, never once meant for anything like this. I found Claire alone in the hallway outside the bridal suite for exactly as long as it took me to cross the distance between us and put my phone into her hand, the photographs already open on the screen. She read fast. I watched her face go through 4 different kinds of pale, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. Down the hall, her mother's laugh rang out, bright and unknowing. Out in the garden, 200 people were finding their seats to watch her promise her life to a family that had already decided what to do with it once the ink dried. "Okay," she said, so quiet I nearly lost it under the quartet warming up outside. "Okay, I know what I have to do." "Claire, I'm not running." She pressed the phone back into my hand, and her fingers had stopped shaking, which somehow frightened me more than the shaking had. "I'm not disappearing out some back door so my father finds out from a lawyer in 6 months. He needs to see this. Everyone needs to see this." The ceremony started 19 minutes late, which in Charleston society sits somewhere between a mild scandal and a story people tell for years, depending on what happens next. I stood at the back, doing the job I was actually paid to do. And through the viewfinder, I watched Richard Bennett walk his daughter down an aisle lined with white hydrangeas, beaming the exhausted joy of a man who believes, with his whole chest, that he's just saved everything he loves. I photographed Preston's face when he saw her, and Nathaniel Ward in the front row, hands folded, watching like a man observing a deal close, rather than a father watching his son marry. I photographed Claire's hand find her father's one last time before he let her go, and understood, looking at that frame later, that some part of her was already saying goodbye to a version of him who didn't know yet what she knew. The officiant made it through the welcome. He made it through a reading Claire's aunt gave about love being patient. He got as far as, "If anyone has any reason why this couple should not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A line I'd heard at maybe 60 weddings, always met with the same polite, expectant silence, built on the assumption that no one ever actually answers. Claire answered. "I do," she said, and for one terrible second I thought I'd misjudged everything, that she'd looked at that whole aisle of expectant faces and lost her nerve. Then she kept going. "I have a reason. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry, but I do." The garden went silent in a way 200 people rarely manage all at once. Somewhere a bird kept singing, oblivious, which made the human silence underneath it feel even louder. "Claire." Richard's voice cracked around her name. "What are you doing?" She turned to face him instead of Preston, which told me who this had really been for all along. "Last night I heard Mr. Ward on the phone," she said. "The moment Preston and I are married, my father's voting rights transfer into a trust, and Nathaniel's named trustee. Not shared control, his alone. There's an unsigned draft in the library he's using as an office, dated Monday, for the sale of the Mills land to a hotel group. The ownership papers include a shell company nobody has explained." Her voice shook but didn't stop. "This was never a partnership, Dad. It was a countdown, and the ceremony was the trigger." Someone in the second row gasped, the sound of a person realizing they were about to witness a story instead of a wedding. Nathaniel Ward was on his feet before Claire finished the sentence, his face arranging itself into something practiced and smooth. A man who'd talked his way out of worse rooms than this. "This is stress and wedding day panic talking," he said, pitched to Carrie, pitched for the whole garden. "It happens more than people admit. Let's not let a misunderstanding ruin." "It isn't a misunderstanding." Claire held her hand out toward me without turning around, and I crossed the grass and set my phone into it, the photographs still glowing on the screen. She held it up, not for the crowd exactly, but for her father, close enough that he had to see it to argue with it. "I have the voting trust agreement, Mr. Ward, the one with your name buried on the last page. I have an unsigned draft of the sale agreement, dated for Monday. You can call it panic. I'll call it what it is." Richard Bennett took the phone out of his daughter's hand like it might be hot. I watched him read, really read, the way a person reads something about to take the floor out from under them, and I watched years of trusting his own judgment rearrange themselves on his face into something closer to grief than anger. "Nathaniel." His voice was quiet, built for exactly the two of them, and completely unable to keep from carrying across a silent garden. "Is this true?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. Preston, still standing at the altar with his tie loose, looked from his father to Claire to the phone glowing in Richard's hand, and something moved across his face I recognized from behind a lens. The moment a person stops performing certainty and starts actually thinking. "Dad," Preston's voice had dropped low. "Tell me this isn't real." "It's a standard protective clause. Every investment." "Tell me it isn't real," Preston said again, louder, and I realized I was watching something I hadn't planned for and couldn't have staged if I'd tried. The groom's own reckoning, happening live in front of 200 people who'd come to watch a wedding and were instead watching a family come apart along a seam none of them had known was there. Nathaniel never told him it wasn't real. That was the whole answer. Claire turned back to Preston. Her voice, when it came, wasn't cruel. It was just finished. "I think you knew," she said. "Not all of it. Not the mill. Maybe not the timing. But you knew something didn't add up. And you didn't ask. Because asking might have cost you something you wanted more." She let that sit a second. I can't marry into not asking questions. I've watched my father not ask them his whole life and call it faith. I won't do it too. She took off the ring. She didn't throw it, didn't make a show of the gesture. She just closed Preston's hand around it, the way you'd hand someone something breakable, and turned to face her father instead. "I'm sorry I picked today," she told him, and her voice broke for the first time since she'd started speaking. "I didn't have another day. I only had 12 minutes, and then I only had this one." Richard Bennett didn't say anything. He just opened his arms, right there at the altar, in front of a fortune's worth of white hydrangeas and 200 stunned guests, and his daughter walked into them, and I lowered my camera, because some things you photograph and some things you just let happen. Nobody ran, nobody screamed. Weddings that collapse in movies end in chaos, chairs overturned, someone driving off in a convertible. This one ended in something quieter and somehow worse. 200 people in their good clothes standing up slowly, not sure whether to leave or stay, while a string quartet that had rehearsed a processional and never a retreat sat frozen, bows half raised. Nathaniel Ward found me before he found anyone else. I was breaking down a tripod near the gift table, trying to look busy, trying not to look like the person who'd started all of it, when his hand landed on my shoulder with more weight than a friendly touch needed. "Those documents were private property," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "You were in the library without permission. My attorneys will be speaking with yours before the week is out, Mr. Cross, and I promise you, you do not want that conversation." "I don't have attorneys," I said. "I have a camera and a business loan." "Then I'd start finding some." He smiled, the same smile Claire had described from the hallway the night before, and walked off before I could decide whether my knees were actually as unsteady as they felt. Richard didn't seek me out that day, and I understood why. I was, after all, the man who'd handed his daughter the photographs that ended an engagement he'd spent 4 months believing would save everything. It would be another 2 weeks before he could look me in the eye, and I didn't take it personally. A man doesn't recover from a judgment that nearly cost him everything just because the story turned out to have a right side and a wrong one. He recovers on his own schedule. I found Claire an hour later, sitting on the back steps of the estate in her wedding dress with her shoes off and her mother's arm around her. And when she saw me, she stood and crossed the grass and hugged me hard enough that I felt the last of the shake still working its way out of her. "Thank you," she murmured into my shoulder. "I don't have a bigger word than that right now." "You don't need one. You did the actual hard part. I just held a camera in a hallway." She pulled back far enough to look at me, and something in her face made it clear she wasn't going to accept that version of events. Not that day, and, as it turned out, not ever. "I'll see you soon, Julian Cross." It landed less like a courtesy and more like a fact she'd already settled on. She had no way of knowing how true that would turn out to be. Honestly, neither did I. 3 days later, a courier delivered a letter to my studio from a law firm with more names on its letterhead than I had employees, informing me that Ward Capital was evaluating its options regarding my presence in the library Nathaniel Ward had been using as a temporary office without consent. I read it twice, standing in the doorway of a converted shrimp warehouse that suddenly felt very small, then called the only lawyer I actually knew, a man named Gordon Blake, who'd been Richard Bennett's roommate at Clemson 30 years earlier and had photographed exactly 0 weddings in his career, but had, according to Claire, never lost an argument he actually cared about. Gordon met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks from my studio with a legal pad and the calm of a man who liked a fight he thought he could win. "It's not as clean as I'd like," he said, once I'd told him everything, start to finish, including the part where I'd lied to a wedding planner about harsh sunlight and to a groom about who sent me into that room. "You may still be looking at a civil claim over it, but think about what a lawsuit actually does for him. It opens the door to discovery, subpoenas, and questions about those documents that he may not want to answer under oath." He tapped the legal pad. "A man at risk of regulatory scrutiny doesn't hand a court more reasons to start looking through his files. My bet is this letter's a bluff meant to scare you into deleting those photos. Don't." He was right, as it turned out, though it took most of a month to prove it. Gordon brought the documents to a corporate attorney he trusted, who brought them to 2 other Bennett Textiles investors, who'd had their own quiet doubts about Ward Capital's deal structures and disclosures for over a year, and simply hadn't had proof, or the votes, or reason to believe Nathaniel wouldn't bury anyone who came at him without both. One of them, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Nkemelu, who'd held a stake in Bennett Textiles almost as long as Richard himself, had been keeping a file of her own for months, dates, call logs, a pattern of oddly specific protective clauses Ward Capital wrote into every deal it touched. It turned out Bennett Textiles wasn't the first family company Nathaniel Ward had positioned himself to control through quiet clauses and personal leverage. It was just the first time the leverage hadn't worked. I spent most of that month photographing other people's weddings, showing up on time, being professional, being the version of myself that didn't sneak into libraries, and spending every evening either on the phone with Gordon or across a table from Claire, going over what we knew and what we still needed. It didn't feel like romance. It felt like homework with higher stakes than any homework I'd ever done. But somewhere around the 3rd week, I noticed I was choosing the coffee shop 2 blocks from her mother's house instead of the one 2 blocks from my studio. And I noticed I wasn't doing it for the coffee. Then, around the 4th week, Claire went quiet. She didn't answer a text about a meeting with Gordon, didn't confirm the insurance paperwork he'd asked for, didn't do any of the small, reliable things she'd been doing since the day her wedding fell apart. I noticed the way you notice a note missing from a song you've had memorized. But I didn't call her, and I didn't show up at her mother's house with a reason built out of nothing, because it occurred to me that a woman who'd spent 4 years being managed by other people's plans didn't need one more man deciding what she needed. On the 4th day, I sent her the folder Gordon had asked for, my original unedited files, time-stamped and backed up on 2 separate drives, the way an actual professional stores anything that might end up in a courtroom, and didn't add anything else to the message. No checking in. No thinking about you. Just the files, her name, and nothing underneath asking for a reply. She called that same evening. I know because I'd spent 4 days flinching every time my phone lit up and telling myself it wasn't going to be her. "I got scared," she said, no preamble, like she'd rehearsed getting straight to it. "Everyone in my life has always needed something from me being fine. My father needed me fine, so he wouldn't feel guilty. Preston needed me fine, so the wedding would happen. And you didn't ask me for anything, not once. And I didn't know what to do with a person who wasn't waiting on me for something." A pause, static quiet. "I'm sorry I disappeared." "You didn't disappear. You took 4 days. Those aren't the same thing." She laughed, wet and short, the kind with a little crying folded into it. "Are you always going to be this reasonable? Only about the things that don't matter," I said. "I plan on being completely unreasonable about you." She was quiet on the other end long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, softer. "I might take you up on that." We started meeting most evenings after that, at Gordon's office as often as not, going through documents until the coffee went cold. One night, back at my studio because Gordon had a dinner he couldn't miss, Claire sat on the stool I usually used for headshots, turning an old contact sheet over in her hands without really looking at it, and asked me, carefully, why I hadn't needed her to prove anything before I helped her. I'd been on the other side of that door once, I said, before I'd fully decided to say it out loud. And then, because of the way she was looking at me, I told her about Isabel, the rented tie, the 20 minutes, the year it had taken me to stop calling it cowardice instead of the truth. I hadn't told the whole story to many people in 3 years. I told Claire all of it. Sitting on a stool meant for nervous grooms getting their portraits taken. And when I finished, she didn't say anything for a while. She just reached over, took my hand off my knee, and held onto it like something she'd been meaning to do for weeks. Richard took longer to come to terms with what had happened than Claire did, but he got there. Claire told me about it in pieces, mostly in the gaps between strategy sessions, how he'd sat her down at the kitchen table 3 nights after the wedding that wasn't, and told her he was sorry, actually sorry, for the bourbon and the wedding nerves comment, and 27 years of assuming that providing for a family and listening to one were the same thing. He'd asked her, at one point, why she hadn't just told him more plainly, and she'd said the thing that apparently undid him completely. I did tell you plainly, Dad. You just weren't ready to hear something that would cost you the thing you wanted most. 6 weeks after the wedding that never finished, Bennett Textiles held a joint emergency meeting of its board and major shareholders in a conference room, with too much fluorescent light and not enough chairs, and I sat in the back row with a temporary press credential the company had issued at Richard's request because he'd asked, specifically, if I'd document it. Somebody should have a true record of this one, he told me, and I understood he meant it as an apology as much as a request. Patricia and Camilo spoke first, laying out 18 months of Ward Capital's pattern in a voice so calm it made the numbers sound worse, not better. Gordon walked the room through the change of control clause line by line, the same paragraph I'd photographed off a desk in a library I had no legitimate reason to enter, now blown up on a screen for 40 shareholders and 2 business reporters to read for themselves. Richard spoke last. He didn't perform anger, which somehow landed harder than anger would have. He said he'd built his judgment on 30 years of trusting the wrong kind of confidence, and that his daughter had trusted something better, and that the board was voting, effective immediately, to end Bennett Textiles' agreement with Ward Capital and pursue new investment from partners who didn't require a marriage certificate as collateral. The board voted unanimously. I didn't feel triumphant about any of it, exactly. Mostly, I felt like a man who'd been holding his breath for 6 weeks and had finally been told he could stop. Claire found me in the parking lot afterward, still wearing the temporary press credential, fumbling with a camera bag strap that didn't actually need adjusting. It was the kind of overcast Charleston afternoon that turns the light soft and even, the kind I usually loved shooting in, and I was aware of exactly none of that until she was standing in front of me. "You've been quiet all week," she said. Not an accusation, just true. I told her the truth, because I'd apparently stopped being able to do anything else around her. I keep waiting for the part where this stops being about your father's company and starts being about us, and I don't know how to bring that up without it sounding like I'm cashing in a favor. Something crossed her face, not hurt exactly, more like recognition. "I've been doing the same thing," she admitted, "waiting for you to bring it up first. I've spent so long being handed to people, my father, Preston, this whole arrangement, that I don't know how to choose something without feeling like I need permission." She laughed, short and a little disbelieving at herself, which is insane, considering I stopped my own wedding with photographs you weren't supposed to have taken and 12 minutes on a clock. That was the easy part. You knew exactly what you didn't want. This is the part where you have to know what you do. I know what I want. She said it fast, like she'd practiced it, or like she hadn't, and speed was the only way it could come out at all. I want to stop waiting for someone to hand me permission. I want to choose it. I'm choosing you, Julian, if you'll let me. And not because you helped me, and not because you're safe after Preston. Because every single time I've been in a room with you since that flower room, I've felt more like myself than I did in 4 years of being someone Nathaniel Ward could use. I didn't have a rehearsed answer the way she apparently did. I just closed the distance between us and kissed her, right there in a parking lot with a press badge crooked around my neck. And it was nothing like the 12-minute countdown that had started all of it. No clock running, nobody waiting on the other side of a door. Nothing left to stop, and nothing left to prove. Just the two of us, finally choosing something slow. Within a week of the meeting, once the story broke properly, Ward Capital's stock dropped 9%. 2 other families Nathaniel Ward had quietly maneuvered into similar agreements came forward with stories of their own, and state securities regulators opened an inquiry into concealed related party interests and misleading disclosures. Patricia eventually traced that shell entity back to Nathaniel through a company registered under his mother's maiden name. Nobody ever called about trespassing again. Gordon said men who spend their days explaining themselves to regulators don't have room left to chase a wedding photographer. 3 months later, Bennett Textiles closed on replacement financing from a regional manufacturing fund with no marriage clauses anywhere in the paperwork. The riverfront acreage came off the sale list for good, and all 400 jobs at the mill stayed exactly where they were. Preston moved out of his father's house and gave a short statement to the business page, distancing himself from decisions he said he should have questioned and never had. Claire never saw him again, though months later she heard he'd started cooperating with the inquiry. I used to think the best photographs were the ones I controlled. The aisle shot, the ring close-up, the first kiss lit exactly right. It took a bride grabbing my wrist 12 minutes before her own wedding to teach me that the moments people actually carry with them are the ones nobody planned for. A hand finding her father's one last time before he let her go. A hand shaking around a beaded waist. 2 people choosing each other in a parking lot with nothing left to prove. Not long after that, I was cleaning out an old hard drive in my studio and found the first set of photographs I'd ever taken of Claire from an engagement shoot at a botanical garden months before her name meant anything to me. Preston was in the background on his phone. Claire's smile was doing the practiced thing brides do for cameras before somebody says something true, except in the very last frame on the card. She was laughing for real, head tipped back, because I'd made some joke about photographers traditionally getting to keep one bridesmaid as payment. I'd forgotten I even had it. I printed it that afternoon and brought it to her apartment that evening. No occasion, no envelope, just a 5x7 photograph held out across the kitchen counter we'd started sharing most Sunday mornings. She looked at it a long time before she looked up at me. "I remember this day," she said quietly. "I didn't think anyone saw that. I thought I'd hidden it better." "You didn't hide it," I told her. "I just happened to be the one holding a camera when it slipped out.